The answer is very, and now we can go out for drinks. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dorothy, for that introduction, and also for stepping in for the head of school, Fiona Mackay. And Fiona can't be here, but I did want to extend to her, in her absence, a huge debt of gratitude because she's been instrumental in helping me and others through the promotion process. I also want to thank all of you for coming. It's almost like one of these really good dreams you have when you have people from all different parts of your life and they've come together and they all seem to know each other, and that's great. So a big welcome to you, and especially delighted to see so many students, both past and present, and I will be returning to you students in a moment and later in the lecture. And then also so many colleagues from across the university, and especially I see many from my own subject area. And I notice that you're smiling right now and you're showing support. And I just hope that that will extend well into the next year. So let this be a notice. And also, I wanted to warn you that I have some members from my choir here, and they have threatened or promised to break out into song if the lecture gets too dry or if the Q&A gets a little bit fraught. So be forewarned on that. Okay, so before we begin, I hope you will indulge me, because I want to say a little bit about how I came from being a California girl, not a beach babe, unfortunately, but a California girl, to standing here delivering an inaugural lecture at this fine University of Edinburgh. And the most important person directly getting me here right now is seated in the second row here modestly, and this is my dear husband John Peterson, but he's also a valued colleague. He's a co-publisher, he's a co-author, he's a co-editor, he's a co-producer of very many things. And John is the reason we moved to the UK in the first place. And John is also responsible in a direct way for getting me standing here, because he's the one that got me through the gosh darn dissertation wave. And ever since then, he's shown unswerving loyalty and devotion and dedication to my work. And he's made me a much better scholar. And I'm incredibly grateful to you, John, for that and for much else besides. Yeah. I would now like to, if you will indulge further, I would like to embarrass my boys, Miles and Callum, who were only came and dragged here. As any parents know, young parents, and if you're an academic, young kids make sure that you don't overemphasize your scholarly pursuits, right? And then what I've noticed, though, since they're adults, is that I am continually provided with insights and observations about politics and global affairs, but also about life and sports and human nature. And they don't realize the extent to which I use these observations and insights in my own teaching. And it does help that they are both studying politics or international relations at rival institutions somewhere in Scotland, but we are not going to hold that against them. So for your insights, thank you, and also thank you for kind of scrubbing up and coming along tonight. Two folks who are no longer with us but are here in spirit that I just have to mention. And one is my dear mother-in-law, Jean Peterson, who was an amazing source of support and generosity and wisdom. And she loved ceremony and pomp. And so I am wearing this gown in her honor, because it would be a heck of a lot easier just to shed it. So this is for Jean. And the second is my late father, Dick Bomberg, who taught me one very important matter, which is that a sense of humor is the most important quality that you can carry through life. And I have found that sense of humor is absolutely crucial for anyone who studies or teaches politics these days. So I thank him for that. But the guest of honor is down here, bedecked in the most cheerful, gray sky defying outfit. And that's typical of my mother, the most inspirational woman I have ever met. She'll hate this, but she's a mother of many. She is a teacher, she is an attorney, she is a survivor, she is a triathlete. I don't mean an athlete, I mean a triathlete, and not just any kind of triathlete. She is a world ranking triathlete. But more important for tonight, my mom is the reason I became a teacher, because she instilled at a very early age the love of reading and the delight of learning and also the joy of teaching and the power of perseverance. This is the most stubborn woman you will ever meet. And Mom, I'm so inspired by you that I have decided to dedicate this lecture to you if it goes well. And if it doesn't go well, I would like to dedicate it to my sons as another illustration of how we can learn from our mistakes and make the best of a bad situation. So we can now turn to the title, and credit for this title goes to John Peterson, my dear colleague. I had a longer title in mind that kind of gave away the answer. And John, who was quite media savvy, says, no, you got to keep it short and you have to keep them guessing. So that is what I've done, but I can explain somewhat the title. I can expand by just, when I'm asking how bad is it, I mean how in you come. More choir members, or the second act. Yeah. Take a seat anywhere, you're welcome. I simply mean how damaging is the Trump administration for domestic and international efforts to protect the environment and to address climate change. Okay, so that's what I mean by that question. And since we're in election mode, if I were to ask you now that question and ask for a show of hands, how many would answer this question similar to the way that Dorothy did, which is, how bad is it? It is bad, or really bad, or dreadfully bad. How many would answer that way? Okay, gosh. Let's start with you then, because we have lots that we could use to illustrate just how grim it is, okay? We could start by looking at personnel, at the men, and they were virtually, for these posts, they were virtually all men appointed. And you note, I don't know how well you can see this, but you note this celebration of diversity in this photo here. That's not at all typical. But the men appointed to cabinet in the relevant posts included oil men, included the former CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. The irony of where we've got today is that he's now considered an environmental moderate. The former CEO of Exxon is an environmental moderate in this cabinet. Smiling over here, former Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt, who heads the Environmental Protection Agency. And note, this is the key federal institution responsible for upholding and implementing environmental protection in the US. Scott Pruitt is a climate change denier. He's one of the fiercest critics of the EPA that we have known. While Attorney General, he sued the EPA well over a dozen times. Okay? And he is joined by other skeptics or outright deniers. And this is all rounded off by Steve Bannon as the chief strategist, an ultra-nationalist, a conspiracy theorist who has vowed to dismantle the administrative state. We could talk about other members, happy to do that in the Q&A, but I think you get the gist there. But these are just the people. So what about the actions? I mean, really, how bad were these policy initiatives and proposals in the first 100 days, first couple? Answer, really pretty bad. Okay? We have a whole flurry of activity by Trump signing a whole cascade of presidential memorandas and executive orders. He vowed to end the war on coal, as he put it, and he especially wanted to target Obama's climate change policies, and especially those policies aimed at reducing emissions, carbon emissions from power plants. So he did this, he thought, with a wave of his pen in an executive order, but he did some other things as well. In fact, he did a whole slew of these. He lifted the moratorium on coal leasing for federal lands. He provided permits for the go-ahead to some very controversial pipelines that go throughout the US, including through some sacred burial grounds of Native Americans. He took, in his budget proposal, he slashed, these are the most punitive slashes or cuts to the budgets of the Environmental Protection Agency that we have seen, but not just the EPA, also other scientific agencies that are really crucial in providing the information and the advice needed for environment and weather and the really sad thing is that this is just a partial list. And I could go on, and we could stop there and go outside, as I said, and have a kind of despair fest. But this is where I want to also bring to you some dynamics that aren't as publicized, at least as much as I think they should be. And these are dynamics that have to do with my areas of study, which are in policy making, who or what really decides policy and policy implementation, and that's important. But also, what about relations between levels of governance, between, say, the states and the federal? How does that affect policy? That's the other area I study. And the third is mobilization. What is it that gets groups or citizens or groups to mobilize, to galvanize and take action on the environment or resist action? And I think if we take some dynamics or some insights from scholarships in this area, we can introduce what I'm referring to here as some countervailing forces. Policymaking in the US is not just about the president, although he gets the most attention, which is the way he likes it. Policymaking in the US is incredibly complex, and it is chock full of veto points and checks and sometimes balances. And these veto points and checks and balances mean that the president's power is not absolute, and in fact, at times it can be quite constrained. So I want to talk about some of these countervailing forces, and then we can assess and discuss how robust you think they are. One, the most obvious one, the constitutional one, the force that's supposed to most directly balance the president is the Congress. And this, on the face of it, and potentially this would definitely be the counter, because Congress is crucially involved in the budget process, and also without Congress's agreement, a whole lot of legislation would not get through. And you might say, yes, but the Congress is controlled by the Republicans. Both houses of the Congress are controlled by the Republicans, the same as the White House. But even when that is the case, the president cannot necessarily depend on the Congress delivering the goods. And we saw that, of course, with the abortive attempt to remove Obamacare in the first instance. We also, when it comes to the budget, there was a lot of media attention on these punitive slashes that I told you about, up to 30% for the EPA. My prediction is that these will not become law, and that's because that was Trump's proposal, but it's the Congress who will decide. And the Congress will not always go along with the president, especially if members of Congress feel that their own constituencies, their own district, their own re-election chances will be harmed by that. And I'll give you an illustration of what I mean. Maybe. Where are these countervailing congressmen when you need them? Either that or, sorry. Sometimes it's about how you approach the congressman. They might like, there, see? It's all in the charm. Networking. Okay, here's an example. Here are two Ohio senators, one a Democrat, one a Republican. The Republican is a Trump supporter, indeed a Pruitt supporter even, although now he feels betrayed. But these senators came together to fight the budget proposed by Trump, not because they don't like Trump, but although in the case of the Democrat, it probably is the case, but rather because that budget included some really important funding for a really important project that was key to their constituencies and their region. Okay? And I know that this is just one illustration, but it's not alone. So what we need to look at when we examine the role of Congress is not just the partisan loyalties, even though those are important, okay, but how might members of Congress's districts and constituencies and re-election be affected? And this is even more the case in the lower house, where those members of Congress are up, all of them are up for re-election again in 2018. So loyalty is partisan, but it's also institutional, and above all, it can mightily depend on how constituencies and voters react. So let's look to see a bit what the public thinks. On the issues of the environment, Trump and the public opinion are actually quite far apart. If you look at a whole, I have one poll here, but there is quite a lot of polling evidence to suggest that in key areas, do you value the Environmental Protection Agency? How do you feel about environmental regulation? Even if it costs, how do you feel? Do you believe in the climate change? And do you believe it's caused by humans? In all these areas, these key areas, a robust majority of Americans are opposed to Trump's moves. There's some interesting polls that reflect on the Paris Agreement as well. As you know, Trump last week pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. Maybe he did this because he misunderstood, because he didn't quite seem to get the idea of non-binding reductions that were required. More likely, we know it's almost certainly was a political play. It's a play to his base. It's a way to play the maverick. It's a way to tell those Parisians where they can go. But that move was not supported by the public. A clear majority in every state, in every party supported, and I imagine still support, the U.S.'s participation in the Paris UN climate agreement. So we know, especially the PIR people, we know that public opinion does not always or even often directly shape a president's decisions. But what it does do is create a context in which other forces can mobilize and act. And we've seen some really incredible mobilization on all different levels. And on one level, we see the mobilization you would expect. You had all those Greens out there, and they were cross, and they were protesting for good reason, okay? But what you also saw is a huge increase in the number of donations and membership for environmental NGOs. An example is Sierra Club, when it's the oldest ones. Its monthly donations have quadrupled since January 2017. The other thing I want to note, because it's important, is that this mobilization is not just environmentalists. Increasingly, we are finding more religious groups. I'm part of a really interesting project that Dorothy mentioned on religion and how it shapes people's views and action. And except for the evangelicals, and they're a big exception, and we could talk about those, but there is a huge increase in mobilization of faith-based groups for action on climate change, for moral reasons above all. And then we have health groups, not environmentalists, but health groups and health professionals mobilizing because of the dangers of reducing some of this environmental protection or the dangers of increasing climate change. So the point we want to make here is not just that there's an increase, but it's become much more diverse and widespread. The other thing to think about when you think of demos and protests is that this kind of action and this support often feeds into the next check that I want to, better come over here. Nope. Of course, we're a little bit slow, but they get there in the end. And that is the role of litigation or the role of courts. I have an aside here, an attorney right here, law people in the room. I have a list at the end of every single photo credit. Okay, for any copyright lawyers, I've got that covered. I just wanted to say. The courts will probably be a more effective check on Trump in environmental and maybe other areas as well. And he's facing already several quite significant judicial threats. And one is you need to remember or note that a lot of his most damaging action in the early days were done through executive orders, not through congressional legislation. So unlike congressional legislation that goes through Congress, both houses, and is passed, an executive order is more limited in what it can do. It can overrule a previous executive order, but it cannot overrule a regulation. All it can do is ask an agency, will you look at that regulation again? And that's what Trump has asked the EPA to do. But this is a very long, drawn-out, complex process because the administration then needs to make the case. It needs to be an evidence-based case, a scientifically based case, and that's going to be a challenge. It needs to make a case that this regulation, say on climate legislation designed to cut emissions, they need to make a case that this regulation needs to be reversed or revised, and then it goes through a public comment period where anyone could comment and you have to answer each one, and then it goes through a judicial review process. And you don't have to know all these steps. What I'm trying to say is that this will slow down considerably, even if the cases themselves aren't successful. It will slow down considerably the implementation. And then there's a whole slew of other lawsuits pending against the administrations on the pipelines that I mentioned, on the coal leasing. And again, what's really interesting to note is these aren't just environmental NGOs making this case, although they're often involved and play a really important role, but these are environmental NGOs combining with ranchers, hunters sometimes, often Native Americans, and it's together that they're acting as plaintiffs. They're filing this case. So it's much more widespread than just environmentalists, although I think just environmentalists are just pretty important too. So, okay, here's one close to my own heart, not just because my mom's here. Okay. The other major check that is occurring and that will occur will come, I'm suggesting, from below the federal level. The vast majority of statutory power and certainly creativity in the areas of environment and climate come from the states or the cities, not from the federal level. And the states can act and often are instructed to act as implementers, and it's in their power, with limits, it's in their power to decide what will be implemented and what will not be. And we've seen an incredible, not just from Trump's announcement of withdrawing, even before then, we've seen incredible action from this level. And I'm drawing from the really interesting, I don't know where Nicola is It's been a joy to work with Nicola on this multi-level dimension in Scotland, but I've also worked with Barry Rabe at the University of Michigan, the expert on this interaction and how states can shape federal policy or implement or not. And research in this area is, there's an unmistakable trend in the US. And this is the trend, that where there is federal stagnation or reversal, say in the Bush era, but also for sure just now, you see the states jumping in to fill that gap and to push the federal level, the national level, further. And we're definitely seeing this now with many states. Which state do you think might be most important to this story? California, correct! My students aren't they good? Yeah. Oh, no. Oh, yeah, no, so they're good. There's Jerry Brown, the governor of California, and look, there he is with Nicola. So California often leads the way in setting higher standards, now under threat, but these will be viciously thought. More importantly, California works with other states. The other state you might have mentioned was New York, because it's another one that's gone much further than the federal level. And these two states together, they're enormously important. I don't know, is this true, Charlie, that those states together would form the world's fourth largest economy? Probably. Anyway, they're important. So what they do matters, and they make up a chunk of the emissions as well. So they're not just doing things on their own, they're forming alliances. They're forming alliances with other states or with other sub-state entities in other countries as well. And an example just from last week is after Trump's announcement, again, that the US would be withdrawing, you had the immediate creation of, it now has 12 states forming an alliance that says, we will meet the Paris Agreement, okay, with or without the federal level, and they're claiming that we have the powers to do so. Okay, so those are really important states, but you might say, yeah, but those are the Hillary, elite coastal cities, and that's not where, some stuff's happening, that's not where it's really important. And that's why I think this next click is really one of the most important developments in the area of states and US policy. And it's going to be a triple click. Oh, thank you, yeah. John, constant source of advice. And always, yes, yeah. Sometimes it's solicited, and sometimes but it's always helpful. It's always helpful. So where the really exciting stuff is happening politically, to me, is that in traditional Republican states, red states, Trump-supporting states in the Midwest, in Idaho, in Kansas, you find a huge increase in renewable energies and a huge reliance, a growing reliance on renewable energy, a huge boost in jobs and investment in renewable energies. And what this has meant, low carbon energy, this has meant is that these Republican leaders, senators and governors of these Republican states have, over time, morphed into champions of climate policies, of low carbon energies, of greater shift to renewables, greater shift and support to renewables. And the senator of Iowa, for instance, was quoted as saying, if Trump wants to remove federal support for wind energy, he will do that over my dead body. And this is still pending, and we'll see who dies in this rep. But it illustrates, again, the point I'm making, that this is not, that we are seeing a really significant expansion of countervailing forces, both at the states. And then below the states, we also have a lot of interesting action from cities. And cities, again, this is where most of the emissions are released. Cities have it in their own interest to cut costs through more efficient energy, but also to protect their coast if they're a coastal city, to protect the infrastructures from flooding, to protect public health. This falls with the cities. So regardless of what Trump does with carbon and Paris and the agreement, the cities are moving ahead. And I don't know if you heard Trump during his speech announcing that he was withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement. And he said, I represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris. And this was immediately followed by, it's not working when I pointed at the, this was followed immediately by a tweet and announcement by the mayor of Pittsburgh, who said, look, hey, buddy, you do not represent us. And not only that, he announced in the next couple days his own state executive order that Pittsburgh, along with several other cities, it's now up to 160 cities, have now pledged to meet the Paris Agreement. That is to level, is to reduce carbon emissions by 26% by 2025, if you're interested. But the point is, they're taking action even when the federal level is not. Okay, so that's states and cities. Computer. I have two other countervailing forces I want to share with you. And one is market forces. Coal is a dying, not just declining, but it's a dying industry in the US, regardless of what Trump does or tries to do. Coal as an industry has closed up well over 100 coal plants. The number of jobs has dropped by 75%. And this is not because of regulation. Okay? This is because of market imperatives. And even leaders of the coal industry will tell you that this is because of technological change, the mechanization of mining. It's because of the increase in natural gas, shale gas through fracking. We'll talk about that later. And it's also because of the significant rise in renewables. And renewables in particular, as I mentioned with the talking about those Midwest states, okay, these have become remarkably cheaper in the last 5 years. For electricity, the cost has dropped between 40 and 60%. More important, if you're a politician, is jobs. You probably can't see this, sorry. This is from the Department of Energy, and the job creation in solar power alone in the electricity sector well outstrips fossil fuels, oil and gas. And this is a trajectory that will continue. It will be stymied somewhat by Trump's pulling of support, bless you, but it won't stop regardless of what Trump tries to do or will do. So market imperatives are not in his favor. And the last set of countervailing forces are external forces. We can't call it the global community because there is no such thing as the global community, but we can talk about external pressures and nudges from institutions and countries. You've seen, if you've read about the withdrawal of the US from Paris, you've seen that it has elicited a tremendous response from a whole host of other parties to the conference, other countries that have signed up to that. And it's actually enhanced their participation and their commitments. So the commitment within the US by states and cities, but also from other countries. And this is Cristina Figueres, and she is the former executive secretary of the UN framework for climate change. So the institution that got through that agreement and that got us this agreement. And her tweet is illustrative of this, okay? That she is thanking Trump for providing this miraculous sense of unity from all other parties, even European parties. Although when I told John this, he said, yes, except the UK. But even the UK isn't cross and galvanized, but Theresa May did say that she was disappointed. So we will have leadership from promised leadership stepping into the void that the U.S. might have held, and this leadership will come from specific European countries. It will come from the EU, but perhaps even more important, it will come from China. And China is well set to step into this void because China has tremendous incentives to reduce its carbon reductions. It is quite vulnerable to climate change. It has dangerous levels of urban pollution. It benefits enormously from the technologies and the building of renewable technologies. So it will, I think we can say safely that it will certainly, if not completely fill the void, but it will be stepping up. And this will have political ramifications for global power as well. Okay? We are a little less sure about other big emitters, such as Prime Minister Modi, but it was interesting, again, to listen to Modi after Trump's speech. This gives Modi the chance to play the moral high ground and say, oh, we are going to go beyond the 2015 Paris Agreement. We are going to go beyond that, and he's been promised support from other areas. So my point here is that whatever the Trump administration does, Paris will continue, and it will continue because there are environmental but also economic and diplomatic incentives for it to do so. Now then, it's time to do some ledger assessing the ledger like this. Am I suggesting that I just told you all that great stuff that is happening, so does that mean all is well? No, I am not suggesting that at all, which is why I've got this satellite image of, this is the super typhoon, one of the deadliest and largest typhoons, Typhoon Meranti from last year. And while I am not comparing Trump to a deadly, devastating typhoon, an unpredictable typhoon, because that would not be fair to the typhoon, yes, you know. But what we do know is that there will be some really grave consequences of what Trump will get through and what he's already got through, both in terms of, not just in terms of there'll be a short-term, I think it'll be a short-term increase in coal, and that mining will be dirtier because of some of the legislations we will have a cutting of the budget. It won't be as severe, but there will be a cutting of the budget. We'll have other areas that will suffer, both in the environment. And also, this is harder to measure, but I think it's really important. He's emboldened those who want to be a skeptic, a denialist, that want to turn the clock back in terms of where we are moving, both in terms of environment. He's provided succor for them, and he's emboldened them. But I am still optimistic. And I'm going to give you 3 reasons. And the first one is not that I'm a Californian, okay? Although that might feed into that. Okay, the first reason Maybe I'm not meant to wander. Sorry, I'm just going to come over here and behave. The first reason is what I've tried to lay out in a very general way. It's the empirical case that I think if we look at the broader policymaking system, not just at the federal level and at the White House and what it's doing, but if we look at that whole mix of actors above and below the state acting as constitutional checks or extra constitutional checks, we will get a more holistic picture. It might not be a completely rosy one, but we will get a more holistic picture. And it also gives us the chance to kind of lift our gaze beyond the Trump administration, which is just useful in itself, maybe. So that's the first reason, kind of empirical case. The second reason will look like a chapter from an American self-help book about despair, and you can't despair, but it's actually based on some very robust psychological research, political psychology research that has now focused, this is a fastest growing area in environmental politics, is trying to examine why individuals, so citizens, but also states and other actors, why do they take action or not take action? And one of the findings there, and I'm simplifying tremendously, but one of the findings is that if you have a huge problem, like climate change or wicked environmental problems, and if you sink into despair, it will not motivate you to go out there and do something. It tends to have the opposite effect. It can demotivate, almost lead to a kind of paralysis. Okay? Where on the other hand, if you have hope, and I don't mean a Pollyannish kind of hope, I mean a hope that's based on experience, based on a belief that change is possible, that will inspire change. And that leads me to my third reason, which is my students. Okay, it's the third reason I'm optimistic. Because one of the wonderful things we get when we teach students at Edinburgh and maybe at other institutions is that you find that these curious minds are open to a whole realm of possibilities that maybe not some of the old fogies have lost. And the idea that they will think well beyond what is the conventional. They're also especially good at thinking about, looking at my students right now, they're in a row, thinking about the future and imagining different futures, different solutions, different technologies, different ways to approach a problem. And I'm not just saying this to stroke the students. I'm saying this because this is actually based on experience in terms of where do we get the most inspiration and hope to kind of tackle these ideas. And very often, if you're in my discipline, it's from teaching. So what I would like us to do in conclusion, I want us to think about, is I want us to look beyond the president, and I want us to listen to students, and I want us to let hope inspire. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for such a totally wonderful lecture. Some of you will be wondering what I'm doing here. I'm Jonathan Spencer. I was head of school once upon a time, and I'm representing Joe Mackay, who couldn't be here this afternoon. He's deeply upset not to be here. So I'll do a deeply upset Fiona's face, make that clear to everybody. We've got some time for questions. Although I guess, spontaneous gestures of praise will also go down quite well if anybody wants to do that from the floor. The man here seems to be taking control of the microphone. He's not allowed to ask a question, but he's going to take it round to those of you who've got them. And when we've had a few questions, and before you get a drink, I get to give a vote of thanks as well, which I'm really looking forward to. I'll usually see what I have to say, but anyway, any questions?
Or comments. Or comments.
Questions, comments, and praise.
Well.
Nothing nasty. Yeah. Wait, can you wait for the mic? We need that to pick it up for posterity. This is the way of the future at the University of Edinburgh.
Yeah, thanks. Do you know of any quantitative comparison of the plans that were made in the Paris Agreement and now since Trump withdrew by the states, cities, and other countries?
Yes, and I'm still mic'd up, right? Yes, by quantitative, I kind of shake when I hear that word. But if what you mean is there data on this? Yes, and in fact, I don't have it on this slide, but the Yale program on climate change, they do a lot of really interesting, important work. They've amassed that data of how many, not just how many cities and states have pledged, what they have pledged, but also seen where they are on the map. And they're the Democratic states, and then you find really important pockets of red, Republican action as well. So I will afterwards. I'm happy to give you their site. Any questions I can't answer, I will open to the floor and my colleagues and the other experts.
Question.
Thanks, Elizabeth. It's Mark Winscore from the same school, and yeah, really interesting. But I've got a question about scale of governance and progressiveness, and so I'm kind of interested in this in the Scottish context and the UK context. So what is it about the states that you think, or is there something in the apparatus, the kind of institutional apparatus of governance that makes smaller scale governance more progressive? Or I'm pretty nervous about this in terms of there's a scale determinism there. So how do you explain that in the American context? Is there something specific about lock-in at the federal level? It's an argument that's quite widely used in some of the kind of transitions literature, that we have to overcome nation states, kind of lock-in around old things, old industries and so on. So do you think this applies more generally, or is there something specific kind of happening in the States about this?
Great question. Okay, the first thing I will say is that there is nothing intrinsic about a state level that makes it more progressive. And you just have to think about the civil rights era to keep that in mind, where it was the federal level that came in. What I think we do see happening is a couple things, especially more recently surrounding the environment. One is that on issues of environment, in terms of energy regulation, in terms of jobs, what you find is that the state is more immediately affected. And so the state has state level actors have a greater incentive to address those problems than might be the case with the federal. The other is they have some more flexibility with statutory flexibility, so they're not constrained by the same framework of legislation at times. And thirdly, although not always the case, but relevant in this area, is that states very often tend to be less partisan. And one of the big blocks of action in both the current administration and the past administration has been partisan fighting and not agreeing, refusing to look for a bipartisan solution because it's bipartisan, and that is greatly reduced at the state level. You'd have more to say. All right, make them work.
Yeah, if we could try and get them.
Hello? Isn't there some stipulation in the Paris Agreement or treaty that says that any country who signs on cannot formally withdraw for either 1 or 2 years after it went into effect, which was just late 2016, and then also practically by the time all the logistics went through the cycles, that Trump could be voted out by the time this really comes to fruition, which is, I hope happens.
Yes, absolutely right. And this was written into the Paris Agreement. So the fact that Trump has said we're pulling the U.S. out, that will take a minimum of 3.5 years because of this stipulation. And it could very well be that that we won't have the same administration in second time around, but politically, the ramifications are such that if you waited, it would send the signal has been sent to businesses and firms and citizens about whether to invest in low carbon. So that is why these countervailing forces still matter mightily, even though, yes, absolutely, the formal withdrawal won't take place for another several years. Absolutely.
Thanks for a great lecture. I'm particularly interested in your approach to what you call public mobilization and the role and value of public demonstration and protest. I'm also sort of stimulated by how we have to cope with and apologise for two things that's happened this year in this country. One is Brexit and the other is Trump. And I keep apologising. I work a lot with artists, and I'm particularly interested in the role they take to complement their own role academically in sort of promoting people to sort of express. We might be able to sort of recall the late Brian Hall's work in Parliament Square in London, re-represented by the artist Mark Wallinger at Tate Britain. Mark Wallinger has an exhibition currently on at Fruit Market. And I'm interested in other artists, the way in which they use protest and public profile for this. I'm helped enormously by the artist Teresa Easton, who is based in Newcastle, and she also recently has featured in the Fruit Market Gallery in promoting what I carry now in my briefcase, an emergency anti-Trump fold-out protest poster.
The handy travel pack version.
I simply draw attention to
it and to
and will always promote
what
artists have got, as you do, in reaching more people within, in your case, the academic realm, in my case, the public realm.
That is so terrifically important. So thank you, Alistair. And also, so two things to say. One, I've got an MSc student working on that very issue in terms of how art can serve as a mobilizer, and in this case, in environment. And it's important for a couple reasons. One is it's important because it uses a different avenue to reach people. It's not preaching at them, it's not protesting, it's getting at their senses through a side door, and that can be effective in itself, but it also reaches a broader broader audience. And secondly, it's part of a more a shift in the public discourse. We see this in art, and the other thing we might draw cheer from is we've seen I don't know if we call it a renaissance, but a real increase in political satire. You know, the U.S., you know what the Brits say about U.S. and satire, but we have that's an oxymoron that you can't have it. But we've actually seen a real increase in satire as a way, as my father would say, as a way to deal with this through sense of humor. But you are absolutely right. This will be a really effective way to mobilize deeper and wider.
Thanks. Wonderful lecture, Elizabeth. Can I invite you to say something about shale? Because you mentioned it and then we're going to come back to it. To what extent is that a countervailing market force to countervailing?
Yes, that's why I put that in there, because I knew there might be another query in there. Okay, I have looked at that. I've looked at data. Okay, on one hand, there are a couple main reasons for the really rapid and distinct fall in coal. And one is for sure the increase in shale gas, and the other is the increase in renewables. Okay, the shale gas right now explains a larger chunk of the shift away from more polluting fuels, because gas is a fossil fuel. But shale is a huge part of that, but it's a diminishing part. And it's really the renewables which which continue to increase, that are set to offset, if that makes sense, the gap currently filled by shale gas. But shale gas, as you guys know, and especially in the U.S., it has a whole host of really significant environmental risks and environmental costs as well. So you will hear people say, but shale is part of the green revolution, but it's not. But it's a temporary explanation for the decline in coal. We could talk over drinks about Scotland and shale. So.
This has been a terrific lecture. I wouldn't have doubted that it was going to be, and I only wish I had done as well. My question is about your optimism. And whether
I knew it! I knew it. New Yorkers.
I just got off the plane 3 hours ago.
Oh.
Full of despair.
All right, okay.
It seems to me that maybe a reason for optimism is that the midterm elections are going to go so badly for him that will feed the countervailing forces. And because I suppose of what kind of guy he is, he might say, well, I'm out of here. I've had enough. I've got what I want from the presidency. It's helped me in my business and my family's business.
Yeah.
It's helped my ego. Why should I hang around and be challenged by all of these countervailing forces? Could you comment on that?
Yeah.
First of all, on the likelihood of the midterm elections going badly for him.
That to me is the most optimistic scenario that I can imagine. Trump needs to go on his own. I think I was talking to my choir people about this, about the possible counterproductive consequences of pushing him out via sort of an impeachment or other means. But to me, the way, if you wanted to remove Trump, is to make him believe that it's in his interests to jump ship, because he wouldn't do that, but move on to something even greater. And that's so. I don't think one. I'm not sure that one election. It would have to be a pretty devastating loss, and you can imagine all the scapegoats that would be provided. But it could be the type of trigger. But thank you. Thank you. You sound almost like a Californian over there. I just do like that scenario. Okay. Couple more, because I'm getting awfully thirsty and this water isn't quite doing it. So.
Then I think we might have to wrap. So, the other one? There's one here and one here. But you don't get one because you're too far back. You'll be up there later.
Hi.
Hi, James.
Yeah, I watched a little bit of the speech by Trump and why he withdrew as much as I could tolerate anyway. And I think a lot of it was pitted around this dichotomy between business on one hand and the interest of American industry and the environment on the other hand.
Yeah.
And it seems that, despite the slides that you've shown about the job being created in renewables and so on, the argument as to, his argument that, it's not in the industry's interests to go with renewables, that's sort of won the common ground at the moment. Do you think that's true? And why do you think the sort of dirty industry has won the appeal of jobs over?
Well, I don't think it has, actually. I think that is certainly how Trump portrays it. It is black and white. You either have environment or climate and people laughing at you, or you have job creation. But not just with the renewables. I think if you get beyond that circle, that there is a growing awareness that it makes economic sense to address these issues, both for the cost of the health problems that emerge from environmental pollution and climate change, but also the cost to firms of the damage of climate change, of infrastructures and storms and disasters. And in fact, also you might have noticed that after the Paris talk, there were several really major corporations, you probably read about, Disney and Google and Amazon saying, we're not, we don't support this. But also interesting, there was actually oil firms included in that conglomerate of businesses that came out against that decision too. So you are right that is definitely how Trump paints it, and what we need to watch is that narrative doesn't take hold, but I see real resistance to that narrative.
Final question.
Hello.
Hi, Chris.
To lecture.
Thanks.
I always like coming to lectures like these and taking something more away than just knowing more about a subject or feeling something. And although the feeling this time has been good, namely relief, I wonder if you can offer, if you could get us all to do something as a result of being here. This is your kind of platform. Whether that's go talk to a politician or have a optimistic conversation about climate change in the pub, what would it be?
Yeah, yes. See what I mean about young folk and their ideas? Okay, so action. Okay, so the message that I'm trying to get across is multifaceted. And one, as you suggest, Chris, is that, and you have to be careful here, but the message is that if we dwell and stay in a time and a mode of despair, that will be counterproductive. That we can't do anything about climate change or Trump. All we can do is revolution. I don't advocate that. Yeah, I'm okay. But I don't want it down a message that I'm advocating. Go out there with your anyway. I'm not advocating violence. But I am trying to get. And Alistair was making this point about art as well. I am trying to get everyone to think more broadly about where the problem is and how to address the problem. Because right now there is, in my view, there's a sense that we have a huge problem, and the problem is Trump. And Trump is a huge problem, okay? But I think we give him too much credit by focusing overmuch on him. So I'm trying to get us to think about other forces that will support him and then maybe target those, and other forces that will resist or halt him and give support to those. And also this would make Trump furious. The worst thing you can do for that man is ignore him. And I'm not saying ignore him, but I'm saying do not give him the credit that he deserves.
On that splendidly positive note, there's just a little bit more to be done before you're released back into the community, or at least into the community where the drink is being served around the corner. And that's to propose a vote of thanks for this totally wonderful lecture. In fact, so scintillating has the spirit of positivity been, that I wondered if we could have if not a weekly, certainly a monthly Elizabeth Bomberg inaugural lecture. I can suggest a number of other topics, Brexit, where you can give us more cheerful. In her introductory remarks, Dorothy mentioned teaching awards, which are actually one of the best things that's happened here in the last few years. Is we actually start to get prizes for teaching. They're given by the Students' Association. And I first really noticed, I don't know whether it was the first year they were being awarded, it was just the first year I noticed. But it was very, very early days. Elizabeth won the big one, which I think of as the most wonderful person in the university award, although it's got some other official titles, best teacher, most valued player, or something like that. And I'm sure I was not alone when that happened, in thinking this was merely ratification of something that her colleagues have known for a very, very long time. Now, it was also mentioned that Elizabeth is taking the unwise career move of becoming head of subject and politics for the coming year. And seeing my old crony Russell Keat at the back, I wondered whether she'd passed the Keat test. Russell once confided to me that he'd always thought of himself as the good person that people basically like. And this fell away when he became
Oh no. Please don't say that. Please don't let that happen. Please, okay.
Many years ago, and before politics was certainly gloriously harmonious. Yes,
which it is.
Now.
Thanks to Elsa. Yeah.
Now, I also mentioned at the start that Fiona was very, very sorry that she couldn't be here. But she is here in various forms. One of them is a big bunch of flowers. And so I'm going to give you this bunch of flowers and ask everyone to join in thanking Elizabeth for what has been one of the best lectures I've ever heard.
Wow, thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you. And Georgie.